They gave us the power to kneel. We used it to stand. The Velthari came to Earth the way all conquerors come, certain they had already won. Their advanced scout, a needle-thin vessel that tasted of black glass and cold mathematics, dropped through the thermosphere at 3:47 in the morning over the California coast. It didn't announce itself. It didn't need to. The Velthari Collective had absorbed 41 worlds in 11,000 years of expansion, and not one of those worlds had managed to mount a coherent defense within the first 72 hours. Most hadn't managed one at all. The formula was elegant in its simplicity. Arrive silent, assess the dominant species, select 2 or 3 individuals from the lower rungs of that species' hierarchy, and gift them with what the collective called the elevation. Enhanced mass, enhanced strength, enhanced durability, then watch. The elevated individuals would inevitably turn on their own civilization. Confusion, fear, or rage. Infrastructure would collapse. Governments would overreact. Armies would fire on what appeared to be their own people. And by the time the Velthari main fleet arrived, 42 hours behind the scout, the dominant species would have done most of the work themselves. It was not cruelty from the collective's perspective. It was efficiency. The 2 small figures they had selected to receive the elevation were, by every metric the collective's assessment algorithms could generate, perfect candidates. They had no institutional power. Their social credit, measured in the crude but legible currency of their species' entertainment broadcast networks, had recently collapsed. They were, as best the collective's translation matrices could interpret the relevant human phrase, washed up. They had no meaningful connections to military, governmental, or civic infrastructure. They lived in a small apartment in a district the collective's geological surveys identified as Los Angeles, California, within a metropolitan area whose primary industry appeared to be the production of elaborate fictional audiovisual content. A decadent signal, the collective's analysts noted, of a civilization past its productive apex. Their names, extracted from the species' primitive identification databases, were Dara Vasquez and Mina Cho. The collective selected them because they seemed powerless, because they seemed isolated, because they seemed, in every way that mattered to the collective's 41-world calculus, easy. The collective had never worked with humans before. This was their first and only mistake. Dara Vasquez was asleep on the couch when the light came through the window. Not through the window the way sunlight comes through a window. Through it the way a searchlight comes through fog. With intent, with direction, with a quality of being aimed at something specific. She woke not because of the light itself, but because of the sound that accompanied it. A frequency just below hearing that she felt in her back teeth and the base of her skull, like the hum of a transformer box but alive somehow, like it was breathing. She sat up. The first thing she noticed was that her empty beer bottle was vibrating on the coffee table. The second thing she noticed was the 2 small figures standing in the center of the room. They were identical. Each stood approximately 18 inches tall, with silver-white skin that caught the light from the window and scattered it in soft prismatic halos. Their faces were humanoid in the broadest sense. 2 eyes, a nose, a mouth, but the proportions were wrong in ways that made Dara's brain work harder than it wanted to at 3 in the morning. 2 large eyes, irises the color of deep water, that didn't blink at the rate human eyes blinked. Fingers that were 1 too many on each hand. Hair that moved without air moving it. They were, she would later tell people, objectively beautiful in the way that very deep water is objectively beautiful. You could see the depth and know, without being told, that something was wrong with going in. Dara Vasquez, the left one said. Its voice was small and precise, accented in a way that suggested English had been learned from transcripts rather than from speaking it. The other one is still unconscious. The right one said, without looking at the closed bedroom door where Mina had gone to sleep 4 hours earlier. The other one is what? Dara said. Unconscious, sleeping, unaware. We had difficulty calibrating the auditory induction frequency. Your neurological baseline is unusual. Dara looked at her beer bottle, which was still trembling faintly. She looked at the 2 small silver figures. She looked at the window, which showed a sky that was perfectly dark except for a faint pulse of blue-white light somewhere above the cloud layer. Okay, she said. Not a question. Not an exclamation. Just okay. The sound of a person doing rapid internal math and landing on a number they didn't expect. We are, the left one began. You're aliens, Dara said. A pause. The 2 figures exchanged a look that was hard to read but definitely communicative. Yes, the right one said. And that thing in the sky is your ship. It is a component of our assessment vehicle. The primary fleet. What do you want? Another exchange of looks. The Velthari twins, that was how Dara would always think of them afterward, with the capital letters, as though they were a named institution, seemed to recalibrate. We are here to offer you an elevation, the left one said. An enhancement of your biological mass and structural integrity, sufficient to render you effective as a force of disruption. Disruption, Dara repeated. To your existing civilization's infrastructure, yes. Dara was quiet for a moment. In the silence, the beer bottle stopped vibrating. Outside, somewhere in the apartment complex, a dog was barking at something in the dark. And what do you get out of it, she said. The Velthari twins exchanged a third look. In 41 previous elevations, no candidate had asked this question. Most had been confused, some had been terrified. A few had been ecstatic. None had immediately begun negotiating. The collective acquires the resource profile of your planet, the left one said carefully. Mineral, atmospheric biological, your species would be a pause managed. Managed, Dara said, resettled a portion. The viable, so you want us to tear our own cities apart so you can take the planet, Dara said. And you picked us because you thought we were too small to say no. The right Velthari twin made a sound that the collective's translation matrices would have rendered in any of 41 other languages as an affirmative. In English, it came out as essentially yes. Dara nodded slowly. The bedroom door opened and Mina Cho appeared, squinting, wearing an oversized shirt that said Battle Babe World Tour across the chest in cracked vinyl letters, a relic from the promotional run of the show that had ended 6 months ago, the show they'd both been fired from. She had her hair in a knot on one side of her head and she was carrying a baseball bat, which she had apparently grabbed from beside the bed on instinct. She saw the two small silver figures. She looked at Dara. Aliens, Mina said. They want to give us superpowers, so we'll destroy civilization for them, Dara said. Mina lowered the baseball bat slightly. Not all the way. Just enough to indicate she was listening. What kind of superpowers, Mina said. They had been, until 6 months ago, the stars of a syndicated superhero program called Battle Babe and Combat Queen, which had run for 4 seasons on a cable network that it also produced, in its storied history, a documentary about competitive eating, a reality show set on a fishing trawler, and 6 different iterations of a dating program. The show was not good in the ways that prestige television is good. It was good in the ways that a well-worn piece of machinery is good. It did exactly what it claimed to do. It did it consistently. And the people who needed it to do that thing could always rely on it. Dara had played Battle Babe, red leather jacket, short dark hair, a fighting style that the show's fight coordinator had described as aggressive ballet. Mina had played Combat Queen, gold accents, a kendo stick she swung with an economy of motion that looked casual and hit like a vehicle. Collision. Together they had faced, across 4 seasons, an escalating roster of increasingly ridiculous villains. The Titanium Syndicate, the Molecular Disruptor, a villain called the Pastry Chef, who had, for reasons the writers had never fully explained, the ability to control pastry dough at the molecular level. The show had been canceled not because it ran out of ideas, but because the network had been acquired, and the acquiring entity had looked at the budget versus the ratings and made a calculation that was correct by every financial metric and wrong in every other way. The cancellation had been announced on a Tuesday. By the following Thursday, the fan forums were either in full revolt or writing grief-tinged tribute posts. By the Friday after that, Dara and Mina were sitting in their shared apartment, which they had moved into jointly 6 months before to split costs, drinking beer and figuring out what came next. What came next, it turned out, was alien visitors. The elevation took 43 minutes. The Velthari twins produced from somewhere, Dara could never later explain exactly where. It was like watching a magician produce something from a space that had previously been clearly empty. A device that looked vaguely like a compass. Rose rendered in a material that wasn't quite metal and wasn't quite glass. They set it on the coffee table between the empty beer bottles. It began to pulse with the same below-hearing frequency that had woken Dara, but stronger now, filling the apartment like the feeling before a thunderstorm. This will take some time, the left Velthari said. The elevation is calibrated to your specific biological parameters. You may feel warmth. You may feel significant warmth. The right Velthari amended. What Dara felt was not warmth. What Dara felt was the sensation of being a string instrument that someone was slowly, methodically tuning, every cell in her body adjusting, tightening, finding a new resonant frequency that it had apparently always been capable of, but had never been asked to express. It wasn't painful. It was profound in a way that felt almost inappropriate, like overhearing a conversation that was intended for someone else. Mina, sitting cross-legged on the other end of the couch with the baseball bat across her knees, went very still. Her eyes were closed. In the pulsing blue-white light, she looked like a painting of something that hadn't existed yet. The device on the coffee table burned brighter, and then the apartment was significantly smaller, not metaphorically, not as a figure of speech. The ceiling was too close, and then the ceiling was gone, and Dara was standing in the open air of Los Angeles at 3:50 in the morning, the apartment complex around her at knee height, the street lights below her, and the city spread out in every direction. All those grids of orange, light, all those highways like rivers of red and white, all that beautiful, ordinary human noise rising up around her like a sound bath. She was 80 feet tall. She looked over, because instinct said to look over, and Mina was standing 20 feet away in the rubble of what had been the adjacent parking structure, the baseball bat in her hand now scaled to her size, which meant it was roughly the diameter and weight of a mature sequoia. Mina was looking at her hands, turning them over, looking at the city below. Huh, Mina said. Her voice carried differently now. Not louder exactly, scaled distributed, like thunder that knew where it was going. Yeah, Dara said. Below them, on what had been their street, someone was filming on a phone. Someone was screaming at a distance. Somewhere further out, sirens were beginning. The Velthari twins were somewhere far below, invisible at this scale, lost in the dark between streetlights. But Dara could feel them still. The same way you feel a watched when someone is watching you. A specific quality of attention that has a direction and a weight. She thought about what the right Velthari had said, with that small, precise, calibrated certainty. Essentially, yes. She thought about 41 other worlds. She thought about managed, resettled, a portion, the viable. She reached down very carefully, the way you move when you know the ground is unstable, and picked up a car from the street below. Empty, thankfully. A sedan that looked like a toy now, which it more or less was, and held it up and looked at it. The metal groaned faintly in her grip. The headlights were still on, two small white points in the darkness. She set it back down, gently, precisely where she'd found it. Okay, she said again. But this time the math had a different answer. General Harlan Okafor had been awake for 19 hours when the call came in and was prepared to have been awake for 19 more. He ran the Joint Rapid Response Directorate from a facility in the Nevada desert that officially didn't exist as a public designation and practically didn't exist as a public conversation. His people handled the things that didn't fit in other people's frameworks. Biological anomalies, atmospheric events with ambiguous origin signatures, the category of incident the internal documentation referred to, with bureaucratic precision, as non-standard threat vectors. He was looking at satellite imagery of Los Angeles at 4 in the morning when his deputy Captain Yolanda Ferreira came in and put a tablet on his desk. 2 of them, she said. He looked at the satellite imagery. 2 heat signatures, approximately 26 meters tall each, standing in what had been a residential area in the eastern part of the city. The surrounding blocks showed moderate structural damage. A parking structure collapsed, a section of road displaced, several smaller structures with roof damage. No casualties so far as the preliminary sweep could determine. Elevated humans, Okafor said. That's what we're looking at, yes, sir. Not mechs, not constructs, biological. The spectral analysis is consistent with human tissue at abnormal scale, sir. Every indicator we have says these are people. Okafor looked at the heat signatures for a long moment. They were moving, slowly, carefully, staying in the areas of lowest population density, which the satellite overlay indicated clearly. He noted this. A construct, a weapon, a force of pure disruption would not navigate the population density map. A weapon didn't care about the population density map. These things were reading it, adjusting for it. Are they attacking? He said. No, sir. They've been walking, staying off the populated streets. Any communication attempts? Not yet. Our people on the ground report one of them, the shorter one, picked up a news van that had driven into the zone and set it back down on a clear stretch of highway pointing the right direction with the keys on the hood. Okafor looked at his deputy. She moved the news van. Gently, sir. Camera was still running. We have footage. He sat back in his chair. Somewhere in his career, spanning 28 years in uniform and 11 in this specific facility, he had developed a sense for the difference between threats and situations. Threats had a momentum, a direction, a terminal logic. Situations were open. Situations were waiting to become one thing or another depending on what happened next. This was a situation. Get me a communications line to whatever assets we have on the ground, he said. And somebody find out if those are real people in there. Dara saw the helicopter at 5:15 in the morning. Not military, well, technically military, but the markings were subdued, and the profile was the kind of bland anonymous that meant officially, we don't exist. It circled at a respectful distance, which she appreciated. It was flying a wide loop around the 2 of them, keeping consistent altitude, not trying to get close. Someone in that helicopter was thinking carefully. She could tell by the circle. A dumb response would have come in straight. This one was circling the way you circle something when you're trying to understand it before you touch it. "They're trying to talk to us," Mina said. Mina was sitting on what had been a highway overpass. The overpass was fine. She was careful about weight distribution. She had figured out weight distribution in the first 20 minutes, with her elbows on her knees watching the helicopter. She had, at some point in the past hour, lost the baseball bat, not dramatically. She had simply set it down somewhere and it had disappeared into the scale differential of the city. "Yeah," Dara said. "What do we tell them?" Dara thought about the Velthari twins, somewhere down in the city, invisible and waiting. She thought about their device on the coffee table. She thought about the fleet, 42 hours out, on a schedule the collective's 41 worlds of data told them was foolproof. "The truth," Dara said. The helicopter was making another pass. She raised her hand, slowly, palm out, the universal gesture, not quite a wave, more a held-open offer, and let it hover there until the helicopter stopped its circling and moved to a stationary hover about 100 feet in front of her face. She could see the pilot through the cockpit glass, lit in the green glow of the instruments. She could not see the pilot's expression clearly, but the pilot was not turning away. "I need to talk to whoever is running this," she said. Her voice was strange to her now. The scale changed it, deepened it, gave it a reverberation that made her feel like she was listening to someone else. She spoke slowly, carefully, the way you speak on a phone when the connection is poor and you need every word to land clean. "Not the person on the other end of your radio. Whoever is running this from the top. Because there is something coming and we're not the problem. We're what you've got. So put me on the phone with whoever is actually in charge, and let's figure out what we're doing before the sun comes up." The helicopter held its position. Then the radio crackled. She could hear it from here. The distance and scale compressed sound in strange ways. And a voice that was male, measured, and carrying exactly the quality of authority that comes from long practice said, "This is General Harlan Okafor. I'm listening." The briefing took 2 hours. They held it in the parking lot of a shopping center in Culver City because it was the largest flat open space, within a reasonable radius that wasn't also a critical piece of infrastructure or a population center. Okafor's people set up a field communications array on the roof of one of the retail units. Dara sat cross-legged on the parking lot. The asphalt cracked in a roughly circular pattern around her, but held, while Mina stood at the far end, arms folded, listening. Okafor himself was below on the parking lot roof in what appeared to be a camp chair. He had the air of a man who, having decided something was worth his time, would give it all of his time without visible reservation. Dara told him everything. The Velthari, the device, the elevation, what the right Velthari had said about managed and resettled and viable, the 42 hours. When she finished, there was a silence. "You're telling me," Okafor said, "that an alien species gave you these capabilities for the explicit purpose of using you as a weapon against your own civilization?" "Yes. And instead of doing that, you called us." "We haven't not done that," Mina said, from the far end of the parking lot. Her voice had the same quality as Dara's, scaled, resonant, carrying weight. "We've just not done it yet, and we're choosing not to do it at all. If someone can tell us there's another option." Okafor was quiet again. In the silence, Dara heard the city, the sirens, the distant news helicopters, the faint sound of a crowd somewhere past the perimeter his people had established. The sound of human civilization doing what human civilization does when confronted with something new, which is to move toward it and talk about it simultaneously. "There's another option," Okafor said. "Good," Dara said. "What is it?" "I don't know yet," he said, "but I know it exists. 42 hours is long enough to find one, 42 hours. The collective's data said that in 42 hours, across 41 previous elevations, no target civilization had managed to stage any kind of organized response that could have intercepted the main fleet. In most cases, the primary military infrastructure of the target civilization had been sufficiently disrupted by its own response to the elevated individuals that the fleet's arrival was essentially uncontested. In the remaining cases, the military had managed to neutralize the elevated individuals within the first 24 hours, which effectively meant the target civilization had done the collective's cleanup work for them, leaving their own infrastructure compromised and 2 combat-capable members of their population dead. It was a perfect system. What the collective's data did not include, because in 41 previous elevations no such scenario had occurred, was the possibility that the elevated individuals would refuse the premise entirely, reach out to their own civilization's military within hours of the elevation, and then work collaboratively with said military on a counter-strategy. The collective's assessment algorithms had categorized this outcome as having a probability below their threshold of meaningful consideration. The collective's assessment algorithms had not met Dara Vasquez and Mina Cho. General Okafor worked on 4 hours of sleep across the next 2 days. His staff, to their credit, worked on less. The first 12 hours were spent on mapping, understanding the exact parameters of the elevation, what Dara and Mina could and couldn't do, where the limits were, what the scaling did to their structural integrity and sensor processing and cognitive function. The answer on cognitive function was nothing. They were fine. They were thinking clearly. They were thinking faster than they'd expected because, as Mina explained, the scaling seemed to have improved sensory throughput, and there was simply less cognitive lag. It's like going from a phone with a cracked screen and a dying battery. Mina told the research team they'd assigned to communicate with her. To, I don't know, the best hardware you've ever used. Everything's just clean. The answer on structural integrity was considerable. Ballistic tests, conducted with Dara's consent and participation in a remote section of the Nevada test range, because if they were going to fight something, they needed to know the parameters, confirmed that she could survive direct fire from anything short of a guided munition. She was not indestructible, but she was resistant in ways that would make conventional weapons largely decorative. The collective designed this to be hard to neutralize, Dara said, after the 4th ballistics test, brushing ash off her palm, so that we'd be a problem for you even if you tried to stop us. I know, Okafor said. That's what I want you to understand going in. They made us hard to stop. They just miscalculated what direction we'd aim ourselves. The second 12 hours were spent on intelligence, not human intelligence, which they had plenty of, but alien intelligence, the actual hard data on what the Velthari main fleet looked like, what it was capable of, what kind of defenses it deployed. The Velthari twins were located in Los Angeles, tracked by the satellite thermal signature of their device, which still pulsed with the below-hearing frequency at irregular intervals, apparently sending status updates to the fleet, and Okafor made the call not to move against them. They're monitors, he said. If we take them out, the fleet knows something's wrong and they accelerate. Or they have a dead man switch, Ferreira said. Or that. Either way, we need them to think the elevation is proceeding as expected for as long as possible. Which means we have to make it look like we're disrupting things, Dara said. She was patched in via the largest field monitor they could source, the image scaled to fill one side of the briefing room so Okafor's staff could see her face clearly. She had been working with the research team on figuring out what disruption that reads as elevation standard on the collective's monitoring systems would look like. The answer was controlled, contained destruction of infrastructure that had been pre-evacuated, in patterns consistent with the collective's previous elevations, performed in ways that didn't actually compromise anything critical. We're going to have to break things, Mina said, from the adjacent monitor. Yes, Okafor said, things that don't matter, or things that we're okay with losing. We have a list, Ferreira said, pulling it up. Infrastructure in advanced deteriorations, states that were scheduled for demolition in the next 2 years anyway. A decommissioned power substation in the valley. 2 overpasses that are already on the replacement schedule. Several properties in the Burbank Entertainment District that the studios sold off last year and haven't developed. Mina looked at the list. The studio sold those off, she said. Late 2024 acquisition cleanup, yes, a beat. Our old sets were in the Burbank Studio District, she said. I know, Ferreira said. I checked. Mina was quiet for a moment, then she said, okay, I can work with that. What the collective's monitoring feed received, over the next 22 hours, was consistent with elevation protocols 7 through 14 across the relevant urban metrics. What was actually happening was considerably more precise. Dara and Mina moved through the city in coordinated arcs, working from the lists Okafor's team updated in real time, dismantling structures that needed to come down anyway, collapsing the decommissioned substation in a shower of sparks and corroded steel that was genuinely spectacular but threatened nothing and no one. They moved the population not by threatening it. The population had by now largely moved itself, the evacuation orders having been issued with the explanation that 2 giant women were loose in the city, and the city government was, to its credit, taking this seriously, but by gently, explicitly, in several cases individually directing people away from areas they were working in. There was footage, from a dozen different angles, of Mina crouching in a Burbank parking lot and having what appeared to be a perfectly calm conversation with an elderly man who had refused to leave his car because he didn't want to abandon his dog. The footage showed her picking up the car with one hand, the man and the dog both inside, and carrying it to the evacuation staging area 2 miles away, where she set it down with a precision that left no scratch on the paint, opened the door with 2 fingers, and waited while the man got his things together. He left her a note on the roof of the car. It said, "Thank you." She kept it. General Okafor, watching the feed from Nevada, thought, 41 worlds and the collective never hit this one. The thought sat in his chest with a weight that was not pride exactly, and was not grief exactly, but was something between them, something that tasted like responsibility. Then he turned back to the tactical board, because there were still 18 hours left, and the main fleet was coming, and what they were building was not a performance. It was a setup. The Velthari fleet arrived not 42 hours after the scout, but 41 hours and 17 minutes, which the collective's algorithms apparently considered within acceptable variance. It was not one ship. The sensor arrays picked them up at the edge of the lunar sphere. 17 vessels, each roughly 3 kilometers long, moving in a formation the analysts described as harvest array, a spreading chevron pattern designed to provide interlocking atmospheric coverage across a planetary surface. They dropped at a shallow angle, bleeding velocity slowly, not hiding, not rushing. The collective had done this 41 times. They knew the pattern. They knew the pace. They came in over the Pacific. The fleet spread across 800 kilometers of open ocean, and they were beautiful in the way that all large things moving in coordinated. Purpose are beautiful. Okafor watched them on the main screen and felt the room hold its breath around him. Target civilization disruption metrics check out. He imagined the collective saying to itself, aboard those ships. Elevated individuals operational. Proceed to phase 2. They think they've won, Ferreira said beside him. They've always won, Okafor said. That's the problem. He picked up the field radio. Vasquez. Cho fleet is an atmospheric approach. 18 minutes to viable intercept altitude. You clear on the plan? Dara's voice came back clear and steady as a compass needle. Clear, she said. Same, Mina said. Good, Okafor said. Go. What happened next would be analyzed, argued about, written about, and misquoted in 100 different venues over the following years. The official military documentation would describe it in terms of coordinated non-lethal intercept operations in concert with enhanced capability, civilian assets. The news coverage, most of which had been conducted from a safe distance and filmed on equipment that struggled with the scale, would describe it in terms of a battle. The fan forums, which had been tracking Dara and Mina since the footage of the news van went viral 12 hours earlier, would describe it in terms that were considerably warmer. What it actually was, from Dara's perspective, was this. She was standing on the beach north of Los Angeles with the Pacific to her back, watching the lead vessel of the Velthari fleet descend through the cloud layer at 2,000 feet. It was enormous in the way that few things she had previously encountered in her life were enormous. Not just big but wrong scale, the kind of large that resets your understanding of what large means. Black glass and cold mathematics, just as the scout had been. It moved with a certainty that was almost casual. She'd been briefed on the fleet's approach angle, its estimated defensive array positions, its likely deployment sequence for whatever came after harvest array. The collective's standard procedure, for what the Velthari twins had been induced to share, was to deploy atmospheric suppression platforms from the lead vessel's midship bays before landing. The suppression platforms were drone scale, roughly the size of a city bus, and they carried a pulse weapon designed to disrupt biological neural activity across a radius of several city blocks. In previous elevations, the elevated individuals had been on the ground, disrupting the target civilization, and were not present to interfere with the suppression platform deployment. Dara was not on the ground. Dara was standing on the beach, at her current height, which put her roughly level with the lead vessel's midship section as it came down. She had requested, and Okafor's team had confirmed, that no military assets would be deployed in her immediate operational zone. Not because military assets couldn't help, but because military assets at the scale of aircraft and missile platforms would have about the same effect on what was coming as a very committed mosquito, and she needed the airspace clear. The lead vessel slowed its descent at approximately 300 feet above the ocean surface. Its midship bay doors opened. Dara had learned a few things about herself in the past 41 hours. She had learned that her grip strength, at current scale, was sufficient to deform the specific alloy composite that the Velthari used in their hull construction. She had tested this on the scout ship, which Okafor's team had managed to track to a dry lakebed in the Mojave, and which had yielded to her hands like stiff clay. She had learned that the suppression platforms, 6 of them, emerging from the open bay doors like dark eggs from a nest, were individually small, enough that she could handle them one at a time. She had learned that the collective's algorithms had never had to calculate the difference between an elevated individual in opposition and an elevated individual in cooperation with a full military command structure that had spent 41 hours specifically preparing for this moment. She reached into the open bay and she started taking the suppression platforms apart, not randomly, with care, with the specific targeted efficiency that comes from having been briefed on exactly which components were the critical ones, which connections, if severed, would shut the devices down without triggering any kind of detonation cascade. The research team had been very thorough. She was very thorough. 6 suppression platforms, 112 seconds. The lead vessel's bay doors closed. Then things got loud. The fleet had weapons. Of course they had weapons. 41 worlds of expansion across 11,000 years was not accomplished through charm. The response to a target that engaged the lead vessel directly was presumably not covered in the standard protocol, because the response took 11 seconds longer than Dara would have expected from a civilization that prided itself on efficiency, and it came from 3 different vessel types simultaneously, which suggested it was improvised. The weapons were energy-based. Blue-white, the same color as the Velthari device on her coffee table, the same color as the light through the window at 3:47 in the morning. They were designed, she understood, to be used against city-scale targets, infrastructure, populations, the broad geography of a civilization being brought to heel. They were not designed to be used against a single point target that was moving. She moved. Not running at this scale. Running was a geological event, something you did only when you had cleared the space. She stepped, pivoted, used the mass the collective had given her the way a judoka uses an opponent's momentum, letting the weapons pass, getting out of the direct line, making them adjust, making them track her rather than the city. Mina was on the second vessel. Dara hadn't seen her move and somehow wasn't surprised. Mina had always had that quality on set, appearing where she needed to be without making a production of the transit, present and ready before you'd finished calculating that you needed her. The second vessel was 100 feet lower than the first, coming in at a steeper angle, and Mina was on its upper hull with both hands on what the technical briefing had identified as the primary guidance array, a cluster of sensor mass that, if disrupted in the right sequence, would cause the vessel to default to emergency altitude hold, which meant it would stop descending and hover in place, which meant it would take itself out of the formation. Mina disrupted the guidance array in the right sequence. The second vessel stopped descending. The formation shifted, adjusting, recalculating. It's adapting, Ferreira said on Okafor's command frequency. It's slower when it adapts, Okafor said. That's all we need. The military assets that Okafor had deployed, not in Dara and Mina's immediate zone, but at the edges, working the flanking vessels, the ones that were farther out over the ocean and still in formation, rather than in active engagement, were at this point prosecuting the most comprehensively planned counter-operation in human history. It was not enough to win outright. 17 3-kilometer vessels carrying the capabilities that the Velthari fleet carried were not something that conventional human military hardware could neutralize by itself, but it was enough to complicate, to slow, to force the collective to respond to multiple simultaneous threats rather than execute a single pre-planned sequence. The collective had never been complicated before. It had never needed to be. The pivot point, the moment that the analyst would later identify as the turn, the specific fulcrum on which the whole engagement swung, came at hour 3. The Velthari fleet had consolidated, pulling the outer vessels into a tighter formation and shifting from harvest array to something the analysts had no designation for, but that functioned like a fist. Concentrated, defensive, trying to establish a stable operational geometry. 2 vessels had been forced out of the formation entirely, one by Mina's guidance array disruption, one by a combination of Okafor's air assets and Dara's direct intervention on the bow section. Neither was destroyed. The Velthari, Dara had established through the first 2 hours of direct contact, were not in the habit of losing vessels. They didn't know how to fight when losing vessels was a possibility. This was, in its own way, a vulnerability. The lead vessel, the one she'd had boarded, the one whose suppression platform she had disassembled, was trying to establish communications. She knew this because Okafor's signals team had been monitoring the frequencies the Velthari used and had reported an uptick in directed output toward her specific position. She let them reach her. The voice that came through the frequency was not the voice of the Velthari twins. It was deeper, more resonant, carrying the weight of something that had been in command for long enough to have forgotten what it felt like not to be. A voice that was used to being obeyed. It spoke in Velthari first. Then, after a pause in English, the same precise. Transcript learned English as the twins. Elevated unit, the voice said. Your behavior is inconsistent with elevation protocol parameters. You are directed to no, Dara said. A pause. You are directed to no, she said again. I heard you the first time. The answer is no. The The voice recalibrated. She could hear it, not in the silence exactly, but in the quality of what came after it. A presence reorganizing itself. The elevation was provided as a gift, the voice said. In exchange for us destroying our own civilization so you could take it, Dara said. I know what it was in exchange for. Your own representatives told me. Are we going to pretend otherwise? Silence. You have 41 worlds, she said. We know. Your own representatives told us that too. 41 worlds in 11,000 years. Every single one taken the same way, none of them knowing the others existed. Is that right? Nothing from the frequency. Here's what I need you to understand, Dara said, and she was aware, as she said it, of the city at her back, all that orange light, all those highways, all that beautiful ordinary human noise, and the ocean ahead of her and the ships above her, and the weight of what came next in, the space between one breath and the next. You made us into weapons. I understand why you did it. I understand the logic. It's a good system. It's worked 41 times. She looked up at the lead vessel 300 feet above, hovering in its emergency altitude hold. The problem, she said, is that we're not a weapon. We're not a disruption force. We're not a resource profile waiting to be harvested. We're Dara Vasquez and Mina Cho. We used to be on television. And we are going to go back to being on television when this is over, and you're going to go home. A long silence. And if we do not go home, the voice said slowly, what happens? Dara thought about the Velthari twins. She thought about their small, precise faces and their too many fingers, and the way the right one had said, essentially, yes, without the slightest sense that this was an answer requiring justification. She thought about 41 worlds. She thought about what 42 worlds would look like, and what it would feel like to be the person standing here, with this much capability, who hadn't said no. Then we have a longer conversation, she said. And we keep having it until you go home or you're too tired to keep having it. And your fleet is already down 2 vessels in 3 hours, which is more than it's lost in 11,000 years combined. And I have approximately 37 hours of elevation power left at current expenditure rates. And General Okafor has assets that have not yet been deployed. And Mina is standing on top of your second ship right now and would like very much to continue this conversation in person with whoever is actually in charge. A pause. Tell her, the voice said, to please step off the guidance array housing. That depends, Dara said, on whether we're having the right conversation now. The negotiations took 9 hours. They were conducted with Dara as the primary interface because she had been the one to establish the initial dialogue. Mina remained on the second vessel's hull as what Okafor diplomatically called a presence anchor and what Mina called sitting on their porch so they know I'm still here. Okafor's staff provided tactical and intelligence support from Nevada. A State Department official was flown in by the 4th hour, a small, precise woman named Ambassador Elena Reyes, who had spent 30 years negotiating in contexts that most people found impossible, and who looked at the scale of what she was walking into and adjusted with a speed that Dara found impressive. The collective, it turned out, could negotiate. They hadn't needed to in 41 previous acquisitions. But the capacity was there, the same capacity for complex adaptive response that had built 17 3-kilometer ships and maintained coherent civilization across a stellar span. When the context changed, they changed with it, slowly, reluctantly, with the specific quality of resistance that belongs to entities that have been certain of something for a very long time and are being asked to reconsider. But they changed. The framework that emerged over 9 hours of conversation that Dara conducted standing on a beach with the Pacific, behind her and the fleet above her, was not a treaty in the formal sense. Treaties required legal structures that didn't exist yet between these two parties, required definitions and protocols that would take months to establish. What it was, in Ambassador Reyes's careful language, was a hygienal framework for further engagement under conditions of mutual non-aggression. In plain language, the fleet would withdraw. The collective would not attempt further elevation protocols against Earth. In exchange, Earth would not move against the collective's existing territorial holdings, would establish a communications protocol for ongoing contact, and this was the part that Ambassador Reyes had argued for most strongly, would reach out to the 41 previously elevated worlds to inform them of the collective's existence and the nature of their situations. The 41 worlds, the collective's representative said, in the 9th hour, you want us to allow you to contact them. We want you to not prevent us, Ambassador Reyes said, from the satellite phone that Okafor's team had patched into the Velthari communications frequency. There's a distinction, a long pause. Why does your species care about the 41 worlds? The collective's representative asked. You have no connection to them, no prior relationship, no strategic interest. Ambassador Reyes considered this question. They were managed, she said, resettled, a portion, the viable. She had read the full transcript of the Velthari twins' communication with Dara and Mina. They were treated the way your collective treats all the worlds it takes. And we would have been one of them. That does not explain the care, the collective's representative said. You escaped the outcome. You have no personal stake in their situations. No, Reyes said. But we know what it would have been like, and they don't know yet that escape was possible. The fleet withdrew at hour 57. Not fast, the Velthari collective did not do anything in a way that looked like flight, and Dara suspected this was a matter of something that functioned like dignity, and she respected it. But steadily, the 17 vessels reconfiguring from the tight defensive formation back to the spreading chevron of harvest array, and then retracting even that, the chevron narrowing as the ships accelerated, until at the edge of the sensor arrays they were a point of light that tracked briefly against the stars and then was gone. The beach was very quiet. The ocean, which had been churned by the movements of the fleet above it, was settling back into its own rhythms, the long unhurried swells, the constant reliable percussion of the surf. Dara sat down on the beach. Not slowly. She just sat cross-legged in the wet sand, the way she had sat on the couch 5 days ago with her empty beer bottle and her confusion, and the blue-white light through the window. The scale was different. Everything else was more or less the same. Mina came and sat beside her. They were quiet for a while. You know they're going to want to study us, Mina said eventually. I know. And debrief us for like 6 months. Probably. And there's going to be a whole thing about whether they can reverse the elevation or not, and whether we want them to. Yeah. Mina was quiet for a moment. The surf came in. The surf went out. Do you? She said. Want them to reverse it? Dara thought about this. She thought about the coffee table and the beer bottles and the 2 silver figures in the blue-white light. She thought about the old man and his dog in the car. She thought about the Velthari representative's voice asking why they cared about the 41 worlds, the specific quality of genuine incomprehension in the question, the way the incomprehension itself was more frightening than any weapon the fleet had deployed. I don't know yet, she said. Ask me in a week. Okafor wants to know by Tuesday, Mina said. Tell him Thursday. That's not how the military works. I know, Dara said. But I just negotiated a fleet withdrawal, so I figure I've got some credit. Mina laughed, the scaled, resonant, distributed version of the laugh that Dara had been hearing for 4 years in various production offices and costume trailers and bad coffee kitchens. The ocean carried it out and diffused it over the water. For the record, Mina said. Yeah, I think the note the old man left on the car was the best moment of this entire thing. Yeah, Dara said. Me too. General Harlan Okafor wrote his after-action report over 4 days, beginning the morning after the fleet withdrawal and finishing the Thursday that Dara had apparently known was the relevant deadline. The report was classified at the highest available designation and immediately began the bureaucratic process of becoming simultaneously the most important document ever filed through his directorate and one that a significant portion of the relevant governmental bodies would spend the next several years arguing about whether to acknowledge. He wasn't writing it for them. He was writing it for the record, for whoever came next, for the people who would eventually inevitably deal with the collective again, not in conflict maybe, but in negotiation, in the long, strange work of figuring out what it meant to be 2 civilizations aware of each other at this scale and distance. In the final section of the report, under what the standard template labeled operational observations of significance, he wrote, the elevation candidates demonstrated, under extraordinary circumstances, a pattern of decision-making that is, to this analyst's knowledge, not present in any of the collective's 41 previous elevation records. When given disproportionate power over their own civilization, they chose cooperation over disruption. When given cause for fear, they chose negotiation over flight. When given the option to be weapons, they chose to be people. This should not be surprising. It is who they were before the elevation. The collective assessed them as powerless because they were unemployed and had lost their television program. The collective did not assess what they had built in 4 years of working together, or what they were capable of when given the means to act on it. The collective's algorithm error was not tactical. It was categorical. They were looking for assets. They found people. Recommend both individuals receive appropriate recognition. Recommend the framework negotiated over 9 hours be treated as the foundation for all. Subsequent contact protocol. Recommend that the 41 worlds be contacted through diplomatic channels as soon as a viable mechanism is established. Recommend that we remember what this report documents, that the correct response to being given the power to kneel was to stand up, walk outside, and start figuring out what needed doing. and that they did this at 3:50 in the morning with no institutional support, no military training, and no particular reason to trust that any of it would work. That is the thing that should be studied, not the elevation, not the technology, not the fleet, that. 6 months after the withdrawal, a show went into production. Not Battle Babe and Combat Queen. That was done. Those rights were tangled in the acquisition aftermath and would probably stay tangled. A new show, built around a premise that multiple networks had suddenly and enthusiastically decided was commercially compelling, for reasons that even the most cynical analyst would have to admit, were grounded in the fact that the two leads had recently been instrumental in the most significant diplomatic and military event in human history. The show was called Standing Order. Dara played the character she had always played, more or less. Short dark hair, a fighting style that the new fight coordinator described as she knows what she's doing, just give her space. Except now the character was dealing with a world that had been changed by the events of the previous 6 months. A world that was reaching out toward the collective's 41 worlds and getting answers back. Slow and strange and heartbreaking in their specificity. The stories of what happened to civilizations that didn't have Adara and Mina. The civilizations that didn't ask the right questions in the first 45 minutes. Mina played a character who was, on paper, slightly different from Combat Queen, but who had the same economy of motion, the same quality of being ready before you'd finished calculating that you needed her. Her character carried a kendo stick. Nobody from legal had apparently checked the relevant prop specifications closely enough to notice. The writing was better than Battle Babe and Combat Queen. The budget was considerably better. The Velthari twins were on the writing staff, which had been their own idea and which Dara had agreed to before consulting anyone, a decision that had caused approximately 9 different regulatory conversations and 3 separate international meetings, but which had produced, in the first writer's room session, what the showrunner described as the most genuinely alien perspective on human narrative I have ever encountered, and I've been doing this for 22 years. The premiere drew an audience that broke the streaming record by a margin that made the previous record look like a footnote. The show ran for 8 seasons. In the final episode of the show's run, there was a scene that the writers had constructed over 3 weeks of argument, and then rebuilt in the edit, and then argued about, again in the color, grade, and which came out the other end of all that argument, looking exactly like what it needed to be, simple. Dara's character, they had never reversed the elevation, she was still 80 feet tall, a choice that the production design team had initially considered a constraint and then decided was a gift, is sitting on a beach. It is early morning. The light is that specific gray-pink of the hour before sunrise, when the dark is still present and the color hasn't committed yet. Mina's character comes and sits beside her. They are quiet for a moment. The ocean comes in, the ocean goes out. They called again, Mina says. I know, Dara says, I'm going to answer. You're sure? A pause, no, Dara says. But I was sure of less when I sat on that couch and they walked in and asked me if I wanted to be a weapon. Another pause. And you said no, Mina says. I said okay first, Dara says. Then I said no. There's a difference. What's the difference? Dara looks out at the ocean. In the gray-pink light, it looks like something that hasn't decided what it is yet. Dark water trying to become silver. A surface caught between what it was in the night and what it will be when the sun comes up. Okay means I'm still listening, she says. No means I'm ready to move. Mina nods. The ocean comes in again, somewhere in the clouds above them, too high to see, something is moving. Okay, Mina says. The show fades to its final credits over a shot of the beach from above, the two of them small against the width of the water, the city at their backs, the horizon ahead, the light coming in from the edge of everything. The note the old man left on the roof of his car was framed eventually and hung in the lobby of the standing sets for the duration of the show's run, and then donated, when the sets were decommissioned, to the Smithsonian Institution's recently opened Galactic Relations Wing, where it was displayed alongside the Velthari twins' device and a section of hull plating from the scout ship and a photograph of General Okafor in his camp chair on the roof of the Culver City Shopping Center. The note said, "Thank you." That was all it said. It was enough. What the official record doesn't capture, because official records are built for architecture, not texture, is the 41 hours between the parking lot briefing and the fleet's arrival. The waiting, which had its own weight, its own particular quality of time stretched thin over uncertainty. Okafor had set up a forward coordination post in a warehouse near the coast, close enough to give Dara and Mina reasonable access, and far enough from the expected approach corridor to be out of immediate blast radius if things went badly wrong. It was a large space, warehouse bones, concrete floor, forklift lanes painted in faded yellow, light from overhead fixtures that hummed at the frequency of tired machinery. His people had filled it with folding tables, monitors, cables. The organized chaos of a command operation built at speed. Dara sat outside mostly. She was too big for the warehouse, by a factor that had stopped being funny after the first time she'd moved too quickly and taken out half a roller door. She had found a clear patch of tarmac near the building's east face and settled there with a field radio the size of a fire hydrant, standard. Issue, one of Okafor's people had rigged it for her scale, a modification that she suspected had been accomplished with a great deal of duct tape, improvised hardware, and spent a significant amount of the waiting time talking to the people inside. Not briefings, not operational planning, just talking. Captain Ferreira, who Dara quickly understood was the sharpest mind in the building, and the person Okafor actually turned to when he needed a problem thought through rather than managed, came out on the second afternoon and sat on an upturned crate near Dara's knee and drank coffee, and asked her about the elevation, not the tactical parameters, the experience. What does it feel like? Ferreira said. Being this. Dara considered the question. The tarmac was warm under her, storing the day's sun and releasing it slowly. The afternoon light was that California gold that hits at a particular angle in the late hours, the kind that makes everything look more itself than it usually manages to be. Like when you've been working a problem for a long time, Dara said, and you finally get the angle on it. You know that feeling? When something that was complicated becomes simple. Yeah, Ferreira said. Like that, but for everything. My body, my processing, I don't know. Everything is just clear. Like I had been looking at the world through a smudged window and someone wiped it clean. You didn't feel that way before? I felt functional, Dara said. Normal, which is fine. Normal is fine. Normal is most of living. She looked out at the city, visible as a shimmer of light and motion at the western horizon. But this is not normal, and I think the thing I want to be careful about is, I don't want to confuse the clarity with the situation. The elevation gave me this. I want to make sure I'm using it for the right reasons, not just because it feels good to have it. Ferreira looked at her for a long moment. That's a careful thought, she said. I've had a lot of time to think recently, Dara said. I'm 80 feet tall and I can't watch television, so... Ferreira laughed. It was a real laugh, surprised out of her, and in the yellow afternoon light, she looked like someone who hadn't laughed in a while and had forgotten how much it cost. For what it's worth, she said, the general thinks you're the most operationally reliable asset he's ever worked with. He said that at 3 this morning, after looking at the behavioral analysis for 6 hours, he said, I have never worked with a civilian who understood operational logic this. Intuitively, he thinks you've done all of this before. Not exactly this, Dara said. What then? Dara thought about it. About 4 seasons of a show that wasn't good in the ways prestige television is good, but was reliable and present and useful in ways that the people who needed it could depend on. About the years of working in the same small world as Mina, figuring out how to be effective in a system that wasn't designed to make them effective. About all the times you fight for a scene the writers got wrong, or cover for a co-star who's having a rough day, or handle a director who's losing control of the set and needs someone to quietly restore order without making it a production. Working with someone, she said, in a situation where neither of you has all the information and both of you have to keep moving anyway, you don't have time to be afraid. You just have to know each other well enough to fill in what the other one misses. Ferreira looked at Mina, who was visible on the far side of the tarmac, sitting with a group of Okafor's analysis team who had apparently been asking her about the structural properties of the Velthuri hull materials and who she appeared to be genuinely enjoying educating. How long have you known each other? Ferreira said. 4 years, Dara said. Before that, we'd done some of the same audition circuits. You pass through the same rooms enough times. You start to know people. But 4 years working together. Yeah, Ferreira was quiet for a moment. The collective chose you because they thought you were weak, she said. 2 unemployed women with no institutional backing. Low profile. Controllable. I know, Dara said. They measured your power in the units they understood. Resources, connections, institutional leverage. All the ways your civilization quantifies influence. Ferreira turned her coffee cup in her hands. They had no unit for what you actually have. What do we actually have? Dara said. Ferreira looked at her steadily. Each other, she said. And the fact that you've been practicing for this your whole lives. Dara was quiet for a moment. The afternoon light continued to do what California afternoon light does, which is make everything look like something worth keeping. That's a generous read, Dara said. It's an accurate one, Ferreira said. I've been doing threat analysis for 11 years. I know what an asset looks like. You and Cho didn't become assets when the collective elevated you. You were already assets. The collective just gave you the means to act at the scale you were already thinking at. She stood up, picked up her coffee, nodded once with the crisp economy of a person who has said what needed saying and was done. Get some rest, she said. The fleet's going to arrive early. They always do. Mina, in those 41 hours, did 3 things that didn't make it into the official record, but that the people who were there would remember for the rest of their lives. The first was the conversation with Okafor's youngest analyst, a 23-year-old named Marcus Webb, who had joined the directorate 8 months ago from MIT, and who, on the 34th hour of the operation, was found by Ferreira sitting in the stairwell of the warehouse doing very controlled breathing. Ferreira had started to speak. Mina, who had been passing by outside and whose hearing at current scale was considerably more acute than anyone had fully accounted for, had spoken first. "Hey," she said, which at her volume level was roughly equivalent to a respectful knock. Webb looked up. He appeared to have forgotten briefly that he was sitting 30 feet away from an 80-foot-tall woman because his expression registered surprise rather than the studied professional neutrality he'd been maintaining for the previous 32 hours. "Are you okay?" Mina said. He thought about saying yes, which was the correct professional response. Instead, he said, "Not totally. What's it like?" Mina said. She sat down carefully in the tarmac, the same light consideration for weight distribution she always used now, so that her face was closer to his level. "Being in there. Terrifying," he said. Then, as though admitting this had opened a lock, "Everything I've been trained to analyze has a precedent, some comparable event in the literature, something you can set up the analytical framework against and run. This has no precedent. We're running every model in real time, and none of them have a baseline, and the general keeps asking for confidence intervals, and we can't give them because the interval is basically it includes everything." "Yeah," Mina said. "And you're..." He gestured at her scale with what she felt was genuine artistic restraint. "And the ships are coming, and we don't know what they can do, and we don't know what you can do against them specifically, because we've never seen it, tested and..." "That's true," Mina said. "How are you not?" He stopped himself. "Terrified," she said. "I was going to say, how are you handling it?" She thought about this seriously. "I keep it in my hands," she said. "That's what Dara taught me. When you don't know what's going to happen. And 4 years of television means there is always something you don't know. You keep it in your hands. You do the thing that's in front of you. You do it as well as you can. You do it completely. And then you find the next thing that's in front of you." He looked at her. "Right now," she said, "the thing in front of you is the analysis. So go do the analysis. Not the analysis of everything. The analysis of the next specific thing that needs knowing. What is the most specific question that would help you most if you had the answer?" He thought about it. "The guidance array targeting algorithm," he said. "If I knew the targeting algorithm priority sequence, it would tell me how the fleet responds to multiple simultaneous threats." "Then go find that," she said. "That's the thing in your hands." He stood up. He went and found it. It was that information, delivered to Okafor 6 hours before the fleet arrived, that informed the decision to deploy the military assets at flanking positions rather than concentrating them on the lead vessel. It was that decision that created the multi-front engagement that forced the collective to improvise. It was the improvisation that slowed them. It was the slowing that gave Dara the 9 hours she needed to negotiate. Marcus Webb made the official acknowledgments list at the end of Okafor's after-action report. He was recommended for promotion. He kept, for the rest of his career, a photograph of the tarmac outside the warehouse. In it, you can see Mina's seated outline against the California sky, enormous and still, head bowed towards something at the scale of an insect by comparison. The photograph is taken from the stairwell doorway. It is a photograph of a conversation, though you can't hear it. The second thing Mina did was sing. This happened at hour 37, in the deep part of the night before the fleet arrived, when the warehouse was running on its minimum staffing and the rest of the operation had been pushed to rest intervals. Dara was asleep on the tarmac. She had discovered that she could sleep on the tarmac with minimal discomfort, which was good, because the list of available alternatives was not long. And Mina was sitting with her back against the warehouse wall and looking at the sky. It was a clear night. Late May in Los Angeles means marine layer most nights, but this particular night was clear, and the stars that are normally lost in the city glow were faintly, stubbornly visible at the top of the sky where the glow thinned out. She sang a song she'd learned from her grandmother. It was Korean, a slow traditional song that her grandmother had called a lullaby, but that Mina had always suspected was originally something older and heavier than a lullaby, something that had become a lullaby because sometimes the things you need to sing to sleep are the heavy things. Her grandmother had sung it to her in Seoul when she was 8, visiting for a summer, not fully understanding the language but understanding the music, the way music transmits things that language holds back. She sang it quietly for her current scale, which meant it was still audible for about a quarter mile in any direction. But it was late and the perimeter was clear and the night absorbed it. One of Okafor's security personnel, doing a perimeter walk, stopped outside the wire and listened. She didn't announce herself. She just stood there for the length of the song and then continued her circuit. Later, she would tell colleagues that she had been terrified for most of the operation. Terrified in the specific, professional, managed way of someone who is trained to handle fear as a variable rather than an obstacle. But for the duration of that song, she said, she had not been afraid at all. She hadn't been anything exactly. She had just been there, standing in the dark, listening. She could not have explained why. She did not try to. The third thing Mina did was the one that Dara found out about only afterward. From Ferreira, who had been there and who told it the way you tell something you watched happen, and have been trying to find the right frame forever since. At hour 39, with the fleet 2 hours out, one of the Velthuri devices monitoring pulses had triggered an anomalous reading on the signals team's equipment. The reading suggested that the device had been contacted by the fleet, not a status request but a detailed query, a request for the specific behavioral parameters of the elevated individuals. What were they doing? Where were they moving? Were they executing protocol parameters? The signals team had brought it to Okafor. Okafor had read it and said nothing for 30 seconds, and then called Mina. "They're asking your handlers for a progress report," he said. "I know," she said. "I heard the pulse change frequency." A pause. "Can your signals team send a reply?" Okafor looked at his signals team lead, a woman named Dr. Song who had been in this building for 11 days running and who looked exactly as tired as that implied, and who was also, Okafor had come to understand, the most technically capable person he had in the building. Song looked at the query parameters. She looked at the Velthari twins device on the monitoring table, still pulsing blue-white in its arrested rhythm. "We can approximate it," she said. "If I have the behavioral data to make the report plausible." "What would make it plausible?" Okafor said. "Something consistent with elevation protocol execution," Song said. "Ongoing urban disruption. Movement patterns consistent with civilian panic response. Absence of any organized military coordination." She looked at him. "It has to be specific enough to pass a collective analysis algorithm. General isn't going to do it." "I know," Okafor said. He called Mina back. "I need you to tell me," he said, "exactly what an elevation that's going according to the collective's plan would look like. From the inside. From the perspective of someone who was doing it." There was a silence. "That's a strange question," Mina said. "I know. Can you answer it?" Another silence. "If I were doing this the way they intended," Mina said slowly, "I would be moving through the population centers, not around them, through them. The disruption isn't an accident from their design perspective. It's the signal they need. The confusion and the fear and the military response converging on us, not on anything external. I would be the problem. I would be the thing that the civilization can't figure out how to handle. Because I look like a person, but I'm behaving like a weapon. And that gap is where their model lives." "Okay," Okafor said. "The movement signatures would be more central. More contact with populated infrastructure. The military response would be fragmented, reactive rather than coordinated, because there's no channel open between us and you. Keep going. There would be damage signatures consistent with disorientation, not pure destruction, not systematic. Messy. Because a newly elevated individual who has been told to disrupt things but not specifically how would move messy. They wouldn't have our current pattern. Our current pattern is too clean. Can you give Dr. Song a full specification?" A pause. "Yes," Mina said. She spent 47 minutes on the line with Dr. Song, walking through every detail. Dr. Song built the false status report from those specifications, calibrated it to the frequency and format of the Velthari monitoring protocol, and transmitted it on the device's signal. The collective's algorithms received a report indicating that the elevation was proceeding on expected parameters. They made no adjustment to their approach schedule. They had no reason to. They had no data telling them that the two individuals they had elevated were anything other than what they expected. Disrupted, confused, working at the edge of their understanding in a world suddenly made strange. They had no data telling them that Mina Cho had just described, with complete precision, the behavior of a weapon, because she had been thinking about it for 39 hours, thinking about what it would feel Like to be the thing the collective had tried to make, to be the disruption, the wedge, the mechanism of her own civilization's unraveling, and she had rejected it so completely, understood it so thoroughly, that she could describe it from the inside like she had lived it. She had, in the only way that mattered. She had lived the choice not to be it. That was the data Dr. Song had needed. That was what had bought them the clean approach, the unhurried descent, the fleet's certainty that they were arriving on schedule to an already compromised situation. That was what had bought Dara the opening she needed on the beach. In the years following the withdrawal, the question that interviewers returned to most consistently, and there were a great many interviewers from every conceivable outlet across every conceivable medium, was the moment of decision. The moment on the couch in the apartment at 3:50 in the morning when Dara and Mina had looked at the Velthari twins and had chosen not to be what the collective had designed them to be. What made that choice possible? People wanted to know. What was in them, or what had they built, that made refusal the instinct rather than compliance? Dara's answer changed across the years, growing more precise as she had more time to think about it. But the version she eventually settled on, the one that felt most accurate, that she gave in a long interview 10 years after the withdrawal, went like this. The collective selected us because we looked powerless. We'd lost our jobs. We didn't have institutional connections. We weren't important by any of the metrics they measured. And that's true. We weren't important in those ways. But they made a category error. They measured us against their own definition of power, which is the ability to compel, to move resources, to leverage infrastructure, to direct force. And we had none of that. What we had was a different kind of power, the kind that takes years to build between people, the kind that comes from working alongside someone until you know how they think, what they'll do when it gets hard, which decisions they'll make well, and which ones they'll need you to cover. Mina and I had 4 years of that. 4 years of a show that wasn't prestigious, and a network that didn't care about us, and a production that was always underfunded. And we just kept working, kept learning each other. The collective walked into a room with 2 unemployed women, and they saw unemployed women. They didn't see what the 4 years had built. And when they handed us the elevation, when they handed us functionally the power to level cities, we didn't lose ourselves in it because we already knew who we were. Not from the show, or any of the things we'd done before, just from knowing each other. You can't know someone the way Mina and I know each other and forget who you are. When things get big, the knowing keeps you anchored. That's what the collective couldn't measure. That's what their algorithm missed. They were looking for assets, and they found people. The interviewer asked, "Would you do it the same way again?" Dara was quiet for a moment. "I'd say okay a little faster," she said. "And then I'd say no just the same." The Velthari twins remained on Earth. This had not been part of any negotiated framework. It had been their own choice, communicated through a message delivered via the signal's frequency after the fleet's withdrawal, a message that Dr. Song had decoded and brought to Okafor with an expression that suggested she was deeply unsure how to file it. The message said, "We would like to stay. We have things to learn here." The message was signed with a Velthari designation that the translation matrices rendered, imperfectly, as something between witness and student and guest. Okafor had forwarded it to Ambassador Reyes. Reyes had forwarded it to the relevant governmental bodies. The relevant governmental bodies had spent 4 months arguing about it. In the end, partly due to diplomatic pressure, and partly due to a viral moment in which one of the twins was filmed helping an elementary school student with a science project about stellar classification, and the footage had accumulated more views in 48 hours than any video in platform history, they were permitted to stay under a framework that Reyes described as ongoing diplomatic presence with associated research, collaboration, which in plain language meant they live with Dara and Mina in a slightly larger apartment that the production company covering Standing Order had provided. And they work in the writer's room 4 days a week. They were small, they were silver white. Their hair still moved without air moving it. They were very good at the writer's room. "The problem with your species' dramatic structures," the left twin said once, in what had become a weekly creative argument about Act 2 mechanics, "is that you insist on making the conflict external, the alien, the weapon, the fleet. But the real conflict was always the one happening inside the human characters. That's literally what 3-act structure is built around," the showrunner said. "Then why," the right twin said, "do so many of your stories spend the majority of their runtime on the external conflict?" There was a silence in the writer's room. "Because the external conflict is easier to write," Mina said. "Yes," both twins said simultaneously. Everyone looked at each other. "Fine," the showrunner said. "Let's rebuild Act 2 from the internal conflict outward." They did. It was the best episode of the season. The note in the Smithsonian's Galactic Relations Wing drew more visitors in its first year than any other single object in the collection. More than the hull plating, more than the device, more than the photograph of Okafor in his camp chair. This confused the curators initially. The note was unimpressive as a physical object. It was a small square of paper, slightly damp at one corner from having been left on a car roof in the marine layer. The handwriting was ordinary. The words were too. What visitors tended to do, the docents reported, was stand in front of it for much longer than made rational sense. They came from every background, every age, speaking every language. The wing received visitors from 40 countries in its first year of operation. They would read the note and stand there, and some of them cried, and some of them just stood, and some of them took photographs, and almost all of them were quiet for at least 30 seconds before they moved on. One of the docents, a graduate student in art history, who had taken the position as a practical measure while finishing her dissertation and had ended up staying for 3 years, was asked in an interview what she thought people were responding to. She thought about it for a long time. "It's not the thank you," she said. "I mean, it's the thank you, but it's more than that. It's the specificity of it. Someone was in a car with their dog and a giant person picked them up and moved them to safety and they left a note. They could have been terrified. They were probably terrified, but they were also
polite,
grateful. They had a piece of paper somewhere and a pen, and they found them, and they wrote the thing they needed to say. I think people stand there and they think about that man, and they think about what it means to do that human thing, the thank you, the small gesture of acknowledgement, in the middle of something so far outside the range of ordinary experience. And they think about what it means that the person who wrote it was ordinary, not a hero, not a soldier or a diplomat or a giant herself. Just someone who wanted to say thank you and the giant who needed to hear it. The 41 worlds took longer than anyone had hoped. The diplomatic outreach began 11 months after the fleet withdrawal, after Ambassador Reyes's team had established a reliable translation framework for 7 of the collective's primary linguistic systems. The Velthari twins were essential to this, spending long days in State Department sessions, parsing not just vocabulary but conceptual structure, the way the collective's languages built meaning from aggregated precision rather than metaphor, which meant translating was less like crossing a river and more like disassembling a bridge and reassembling it in a different topology. The first 41 worlds were in various states of what the diplomatic corps carefully called post-elevation integration, meaning the collective had taken them, managed them, resettled the viable portions, and left the remainder to organize under whatever forms of collective existence they could build in the spaces the collective had designated for habitation. Some of those forms were remarkable, some were devastating. The third world they made contact with, the collective's designation, translated roughly as World Under Second Star of the Spiral Arm, a name the diplomatic team, shortened to KL for working purposes, had been elevated 63 years prior. Long enough for the initial chaos to have settled into a new kind of stability. Long enough for the survivors to have built something that looked, from a distance, like civilization and looked, up close, like civilization shaped by the memory of catastrophic loss. The lead envoy to Kale was a young diplomat named Josephine Arundel, 29 years old, fluent in 4 languages, and the collective's primary translation framework, who had joined the new Galactic Relations Division out of a graduate program in xenolinguistics that had been established 18 months after the withdrawal. She was small, thorough, and had a quality that her supervisors noted in her performance reviews as appropriate uncertainty, meaning she consistently understood the precise degree to which she did not know what she was walking into, and treated that understanding as a working variable rather than an obstacle. She made first contact with Kale's surface community via a relay through the Velthari Communications Network. The twins had facilitated access, and spent 3 months in careful indirect dialogue before the Kale community agreed to a direct transmission. What she heard in that first direct transmission was a voice that had spent 63 years learning to compress grief into pragmatism, the way you compress a spring, all the force still there, held in different geometry. "You escaped them," the voice said. "We negotiated a withdrawal," Arundel said. "The same thing," the voice said. "No," she said. "Not the same. They left, but they're still there. We're building a framework for ongoing relationship. Manage coexistence." A pause on the line. "Manage," the voice said. Arundel felt the word land, felt its history. "Wrong word," she said. "I'm sorry." Another pause. Longer. "You know what it means," the voice said. "The word. What it means when they use it." "Yes," she said. "We know." "Good," the voice said. "Then we can talk." Arundel's first report back to Ambassador Reyes ran to 40 pages. The essential content was this. The Kegel community had spent 63 years developing, in isolation, a remarkable body of knowledge about the collective's operational patterns, the fleet movements, the monitoring protocols, the specific vulnerabilities in the elevation device that they had reverse-engineered from one that had malfunctioned during their own elevation. Information that would have been 63 years ago exactly what Earth needed before the fleet arrived. Information they had been holding for 63 years with no way to give it to anyone. Reyes read the 40-page report twice. Then she called Dara. "I need you to read something," she said. Dara read it. She read it sitting in the living room of the larger apartment, which had been modified to give her adequate space. The living room was a converted warehouse unit attached to the building, with a retractable roof section, with the Velthari twins on the windowsill across from her, their hair moving in no wind, watching her face. "They had everything we needed," Dara said when she finished. "Yes," Reyes said. "And they've been holding it for 63 years with nowhere to send it." "Yes." A long silence. "How many of the 41 are like that?" Dara said. Reyes was quiet for a moment. "We don't know yet," she said. "But Kale is the third one we contacted. 2 of the first 3 had things to share." "So?" Dara looked at the twins. The left twin said nothing. The right twin said, "The collective's operational assumption was that the elevated worlds had no way to communicate with one another. They do not. There is no channel. But they have been thinking, for a very long time, about what they would say if someone listened." "They've been waiting," Dara said. "Yes," the right twin said. "For 63 years, some of them. For longer," the left twin said quietly. "Some worlds were elevated well before Kale." Dara set the report down. She looked at the ceiling of the converted warehouse unit, which was open to a sky that was going gray-blue with the evening, the stars appearing one by one at the high edge of the color. "Okay," she said. She said it the same way she had said it the first night. Not a question, not an exclamation. The sound of rapid internal math landing on a number you didn't expect. But this time the math didn't lead to no. It led somewhere further than no, somewhere that no was only the beginning of. Somewhere that required building the channel the 41 worlds had been waiting 63 years for. Somewhere that required learning to listen at a scale that made even the elevation seem small. Not the scale of size, but the scale of time. The scale of history, the scale of all the things that had happened to all the worlds that the collective had moved through on its 11,000-year expansion, and that had never had anyone to hear them. The collective was not an enemy anymore. Not exactly. They were a civilization that had built a system of conquest so efficient they had never needed to reckon with what it left behind. And the reckoning was coming now, not as punishment but as consequence, the slow, necessary, uncomfortable work of facing what you've made. Earth was going to be part of that. Earth had apparently elected, at 3:50 in the morning in a small apartment in Los Angeles, to be part of that. Dara thought about this. Then she called Mina, who was at the production offices across the city, in the middle of a script meeting. "Are you busy?" Dara said. "Script meeting," Mina said. "Act 2 is falling apart. Tell them to rebuild it from the internal conflict outward," Dara said. A pause. "Is this about the report?" "Yeah." Another pause. "Give me 10 minutes," Mina said. "I'll call you back." She called back in 8. "Okay," she said. Dara said. "Who do we call first?" "Arundel says Kale is ready. She's been in contact for 3 months. They trust her. Then we start there." Yeah, they did. That conversation, the first direct transmission between Earth and Kale, carried on a frequency the Velthari twins had opened, and Dara and Mina were the first voices through. Lasted 4 hours and covered the collective's operational vulnerabilities, the Kale community's 63 years of accumulated knowledge. And in the final 20 minutes, a long, careful, difficult conversation about what it meant to have survived the thing that had taken everything you had, and to be still, improbably, present on the other side of it. The Kale voice, near the end, said something that Arundel later translated with the note that she was not fully confident in the translation, that the original phrasing carried implications she could only partially render. What it said, as best she could determine, was something like, "We thought we were the only ones. We knew we were not. But we thought it as though we were." Dara, who had not had a translator present and had been working from the framework the twins had given her, understood it differently. She understood it as, "We carried this alone. So long we forgot what not alone felt like." "You're not anymore," she said. There was a silence on the frequency. Then the voice said in careful, transcript-learned English 2 words that had traveled 63 years of isolation and were now arriving somewhere they could land. "Thank you." The conversation continued. Outside, the California evening deepened into night, and the stars came fully out above the open roof. and the city made its ordinary beautiful noise around the warehouse unit where two people who had been given the power to ruin everything sat together in the dark and kept talking. They were very good at this. They had been practicing for years.